Excellent. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome to this rendezvous on building resilient economies and societies with renewables, where we'll focus on the economy part. So before jumping in, my name is Rana. I'm heading the Rent-to-Own Secretariat here in Paris, and I'm very, very excited to welcome all of you here and also in the LinkedIn stream. So some recommendations. Please turn off your mic and add your names and organizations. So rename yourself so that we know who's online. Please don't hesitate if you can to also open up your camera, because it's really nice to, even in the virtual space, to know who's around. And please, if you use a chat to say hi to your peers, and tell us, introduce yourself, tell us where you're connecting from. So very warm welcome again, and thank you for joining us for our Global RENdez-vous Dialogue Series that is actually focusing on building resilient economies and societies with renewables. So this is the third rendezvous on this topic. We had one on building basically climate resilience, one on building social and societal resilience, and today we will specifically look into the aspect of economic resilience. So the role of renewable energy for building economic or for driving economic development, but also for ensuring that we have basically strong and resilient economies is something that is really important, and we really want to explore more. We do see that resilience is a very important topic, not only in the context of climate, but also of conflict, and very clearly also economic developments. You see like up and downs, and I think these last days clearly show that renewable energy can offer opportunities to build economies that are different than the fossil fuel dependent economies. The Global Rendezvous Dialogues are really a space for open discussions. We bring the multi-stakeholder voices in, and please, for the participants, don't hesitate to participate in the chat, but you'll also have the possibility after the panel discussion basically to join into the discussion. Very quickly on the multi-stakeholder, we clearly see that especially in these times, it is important to have multi-stakeholder dialogues and collaboration to really achieve a fair and a fast transition to renewables. And I think in the geopolitical landscape, we clearly see that we also need to bring the different perspectives together, but also build on our collective voice to push the changes that are needed to really harness the benefits of renewables for our societies and economies. So I think what I would also like to mention at the end is we, in parallel to the rendezvous series, we also have presented some renewable for resilient briefs just to start and kick off basically the discussion about resilience with renewable energy, and I really invite you to basically explore these briefs, but also share your views, your comments, and additional ideas on that. So super happy to have Sam Kimmins was on. He is going to make a lightning talk to kick us off. And really show, Sam, you're going to introduce why renewables is essential to drive economic development. I think especially these days, some players seem to question this, but also the resilience aspect. So Sam Kimmins is Director of Energy from the Climate Group. And I think what is really interesting also, Sam, is you have worked for many, many years on RE100, EE100, so bringing renewables and energy efficiency together, but also from a business side and energy consuming sectors. And I think that's basically a voice which is really important to hear. So Sam, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Rana. And if you could stick my first slide up, please, that'd be great. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. It's great to be speaking to you all today, and I'm going to be focusing on the why bit rather than the how bit of why renewables are essential to build resilient economic development. So, next slide, please. I'm going to refer back to our own work in Climate Group to start with, to provide some context here. So the Climate Group brings together networks of businesses and governments to drive climate action fast. And as Rana mentioned, one of those networks is RE100, which brings together over 400 of the world's largest companies committed to using 100% renewable electricity across their entire global operations. And many of those companies also reaching into their supply chains to require them to use 100% renewable electricity. Now, the overall demand of those companies exceeds the electricity demand of Germany. If RE100 was a country, we would be one of the 10th largest economies on the planet in terms of electricity use. So this has a real impact. But the question is why? Why are these companies, in the context of this talk, why are these companies doing it? And on the next slide, please, why did the leader of a major Asian export economy recently describe RE100 as a critical consideration for industrial policy? Well, I'm going to seek to answer those questions focusing entirely on economic issues, knowing that most people on this call are deeply familiar with climate issues and probably are sick to the back teeth of hearing the name of various climate conferences and 1.5 degrees. So I will stick entirely to those things are incredibly important, but I'm going to stick with the economy for now. So next slide, please. So first of all, renewables make business sense. A lot of our members say they're buying renewables because they're cheap or because they want to know how to play in the market because they're going to be cheap in all the markets they're operating in. I don't think I need to go into much more depth on this slide, and REN21's done some great work on this. So I shall, renewables are cheap. They're getting, on the whole, cheaper, apart from some blips due to interest rates. So next slide, please. Secondly, renewables are proving extremely resilient to geopolitical shocks. To give you the example of the war in Ukraine, this clearly demonstrated the vulnerability of oil and gas prices and supply chains. In the UK, the average household relies on gas for heating and spent an extra £800, that's around 50% more, on gas in winter of 2022 compared to 2021. And now renewables have buffered that impact for most countries, which has enabled Europe to take the political position that it has in the Ukraine war. Without renewables, we will be in a very, very different position. With 23% of electricity supplied across Europe by wind and solar, providing a critical buffer. And as Ember reported, cutting gas costs by 12 billion euros, really providing that buffer. So a strong domestic renewable supply is a great hedge against geopolitical turmoil. And but taking that a step further, if we were to have 100% renewables 24/7 plus EV fleets, we can completely decouple ourselves. You can completely decouple your economy from those geopolitical shocks. So on to number 3. And this is the one that, next slide, please. This is the one that the leader of the large Asian economy was talking about, access to markets. With CBAM in full swing and an increasing number of companies insisting that their suppliers use 100% renewable electricity, RE100 and renewable electricity access is being, as one of our members described it, the passport to international trade. If you can't get hold of renewables, companies will be locked out of international supply chains. They will have trouble accessing the European market. And this trend, despite the turnaround in the US, this trend is not slowing down in the corporate world. So to have a resilient export economy. Countries such as Indonesia, China, Vietnam, etc., all understand that renewables are an essential part of their export economy. And this isn't just European companies and US companies. TSMC in Taiwan, Delta Electronics, and Samsung, all these Asian companies are also asking their suppliers to use renewable electricity. This is a global trend. Next slide, please. Now, forward-thinking economies are thinking beyond the benefits of just using renewables, the access to markets and the cost savings of renewables. They're looking at the opportunities of more broadly embracing the renewable economy. So, for example, China looked forward and went, okay, rather than just looking at using renewables, how can we become the world's leading exporter of renewables? And now their solar export industry dominates the world, so really taking advantage. Now, taking advantage of that situation. Now, to take this to its ultimate conclusion, I want to take a step back. The historic location of many industries is due to a confluence of many complex issues, such as the location of the raw materials, having skilled workers, having the transport routes in and out, but also where you can get the energy. So what happens when the fuel source for key industries changes? We know that we're going to see a reshaping of power dynamics away from countries like Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, etc., that have made their wealth through fossil fuel exports. The energy transition will fundamentally change that. But it is more complex than that and more sophisticated than that, the way we need to look at the geopolitical changes that will result. For example, in future, iron ore refining and steel production will be powered by renewables and by hydrogen, by green hydrogen. Both of these are extremely difficult to stick on a ship. And as we've seen from the Sun cable experience, it's extremely difficult to get a cable from Australia to, say, Singapore. It's been tried, it may be tried again, but it's not easy. So, are we going to be seeing Australia and other countries continuing to export their raw materials to a steel plant in South Korea? Or, if you're Australia, let's say you're South Australia, which is nearly 100% renewable and will have more than enough renewables to supply its own needs, or if you're Namibia, which has a similar renewable ambition, both of those countries, both those regions have extremely large iron ore resources. So are you going to struggle to find economic ways to export your renewable electricity, your hydrogen, and your ore to South Korea? Or are you going to persuade that South Korean steelmaker to invest in Australia or Namibia and process that iron ore on your doorstep using domestic sunshine? And the latter is exactly what's happening, as you can see from this headline, leading to increased talk of new renewable energy superpowers, those countries that can generate their own electricity, starting to offshore the industries of the current major manufacturing and heavy industrial countries. Which brings me on to my final point. Next slide, please. I'm only going to cover one of these due to I don't want to go over time. The renewable transition can bring huge advantages to the companies and countries that plan ahead, but there is also potential for enormous disruption. And looking at point 2 and 3, we need to make sure that workers and communities are not left behind. A truly resilient renewable economy is one where the workers and communities that were previously reliant on old industries like oil extraction, refining, coal mining, ICE, car manufacture, etc., are not left behind and don't feel the risk of being left behind. We're already seeing a backlash from the fear that that can create. My industry is going, what will my community do? We don't want to repeat the mistakes of, say, the government in the UK in the 80s when we closed all the coal mines very, very suddenly. Absolute carnage. Well thought transition plans are critical to ensure we're creating a new economy that's where everybody can participate and everyone can thrive, and everybody's working together to drive that new clean energy economy. So thank you very much. I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think in giving us some keys, but also some tough questions, right? Especially, I mean, when I hear like everybody needs to work together, especially in these times, I think this seems quite a challenging topic. And the question also is like, what do we basically build up as policy frameworks, but also from the community side to really ensure that we can continue working together. Maybe a very quick follow-up question to you, because I really liked, we had a discussion in the preparation, and you spoke about Kodak as an example, and I would just love if you could just take 15 seconds, 30 seconds to explain us this angle too, because I think it's industrial policy seems to be at the forefront, but
Sure, this was a story that was going around a few years ago, and the idea that, you know, Kodak missed the boat on digital film and just went bust because they didn't bother doing anything. And you know, it's the classic case of you know, the oyster with its the ostrich, not the oyster, the ostrich with its head in the sand, completely ignored the transition and went bust. And we call that it is referred to as the Kodak moment, as a play on words of the Kodak ads of the happy family photo. Well, the Kodak moment was the moment they realized, oh, we're going to go bust. Now, the real story is a bit more complex. Kodak actually invented the digital camera, and they went all in on trying to incorporate digital into film. They were firm believers that you needed film as your baseload for taking photos. Film is reliable. You will never get the processing power of digital up to scratch. It takes way too much storage to have digital photography. Quite a lot of parallels with the energy industry, but in an entirely different area. Now, so what Kodak did, they invested heavily in things like a digital back for your film camera. Mm-hmm. They invested heavily in hybrid technologies, while their competitors were going all in. And also new companies that weren't doing cameras before, like Sony, thought, okay, we do digital, we can do this better than Kodak does. And so Kodak were very surprised when they were overtaken by digital, because they thought they were all over it. They invented the thing. The challenge was they were locked in to the apparent safety net of the old world. And that's what we need to be incredibly careful of, with everything from EVs, renewable economies, weaning ourselves off gas. We can't be investing in the old. We need to be investing in the new to make sure that the money is going in the right place. Mm-hmm. So make sure that enough money is going in the right place, that we get there quickly enough.
Mm-hmm. So no baseload with fossil fuel. That's a message. Thank you so much, Sam. And I'll bring you in back later for the Q&A. And now let's directly jump into the panel discussion. Very excited to have three great speakers who will share their insights. Sophia Martinez, who is a policy director of the Green Economy Coalition. Hi, Sophia. Brian Motherway, Head of Energy Efficiency and Inclusive Transitions from IEA. Hello, Brian. And Nazra Nanda, CEO of the Kenya Green Building Society. Hello, Nazra. So...
Hi, Rana. Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'll just directly build. You have heard Sam's introductions. I think you come in from very different entry points, I would say, and I think this is what is interesting. When we speak about economies, there are different types of economies and ways to look at basically the economic story of renewables. So maybe just a question for all of you. Why are renewables critical for strong, sustainable, resilient economic development and economies? And if you could maybe use this also to touch upon Sam's entry remarks. Sophia, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Rana. I think it's a very timely discussion in these current times that we are living, and Sam already pointing out this backlash against green policies at large, and renewables are at the heart of it. And we cannot fool ourselves. The transitions are always causing disruption, and there's going to be losers in the transition, some winnings, and this is the way it is handled. How are we going to solve this problem? It's from the perspective from a green economy at large, and like calling to the energy community to go beyond the energy, beyond the megawatts and the megawatts hour that sometimes is kind of the focus for the energy people. Is more focusing on how renewables are building green public services. I think that the backlash against green policies is because there are crises all over the world. Sam already mentioned some of them, but I'm not going to name them because there are too many, unfortunately. And that's why also these new waves or protectionism are growing. And protectionism as such shouldn't be a bad thing, but if you are protecting yourself while, but just in your own interest, then you are going to create more damage than good. So this is why this notion of green public services and how renewables are helping to create more resilient societies, resilient in the terms of social dimension, the economic dimension, and the environmental dimension. This is the only way that we can create growth, and then we can measure growth differently. I think that I would also like to bring here the notion of, I mean, we know that beyond GDP has been referenciated in the Pact for the Future. It is very much related to the 2030 agenda. Not that these UN frameworks are the only framework, but at least it's giving us a common language that is also very important in this interconnected world to understand the progress that we are making. And it's important to measure how renewables are contributing to these areas. That could be affordable housing, that could be transport, that could be industry that is creating jobs. But it's done in a way, and also Sam was finishing the presentation in the way that the workers feel that they are listened to, the communities are listened to, the indigenous people are listened to, the human rights are respected, indigenous rights are respected, and these just transition pathways or people-centered transitions are put at the heart of this holistic approach to planning the economy. So we are not talking energy, climate, trade, like different areas. And maybe to finalize is creating resilient economies, because we are promoting diversified economies. That is also kind of the way to move forward and to advance and to create healthy societies. And it's also affecting health and education and areas that sometimes when we are talking about public-private partnerships are kind of left behind, but renewables will have a very strong positive impact in health, water, and education. And it will greatly vary if we're talking about Europe or Africa or Latin America or North America. The situation is very different, but the impact is positive at large. I'm not sure if I have been very concrete, but
no, but I think it's like a concrete already, because I think it's very clear. I think one strong message here is getting basically the energy discussion out into the economic discussion, and what are the economies we shape for prosperous societies. I think this is but also the fact that we need to transition this. Let me turn to you, Brian. I think I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Why renewables? Why are they critical? But also, in your view, what are robust, resilient economies with renewables look like? And we heard about the transitions. We see currently or these days a lot of pushback, especially from fossil fuel producing countries, sectors, etc. How do we actually manage to still win the battle, I guess, that renewable energy makes economic sense and is an opportunity for strong and resilient economies and societies?
Thank you, Rana, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, obviously, you're raising a lot in your questions there, Rana. I think everyone in this call, everyone in today's meeting agrees that renewables have great benefits to bring socially and economically and environmentally, and there's no question about that. I think that maybe when we see which countries have succeeded most in really putting the right policies in place to allow investment in renewables and to really grow the share of renewables, it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of what the underlying drivers are for those policies. And I think this really matters to not just say renewables are good in themselves, but to understand what countries and societies are looking for in terms from renewable energy. And there are many dimensions, but of course, when we talk about resilience, just one or two that clearly come to mind is, first of all, countries always benefit economically in broad terms when they're able to rely more on their own resources rather than dependence on imports, particularly dependence on imports with volatile prices. And we see a lot of countries understanding that they may not be rich in conventional fuels, but they are rich in renewable resources. And having said that, of course, that doesn't map onto success necessarily today. And we'll hear from Nasra in a minute, who knows much better that Africa has tremendously rich renewable resources, and progress is steady. But so far, the share of renewable deployment in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa as a whole, is much lower than it should be if you were to think in resource terms. And there's many single European countries with more PV installed than the whole continent of Africa. And I can tell you from experience, few parts of northwestern Europe are as sunny as most parts of Africa. And so there's a real mismatch there, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the key questions there, most notably the cost of capital, which don't line up. And I think I raise that because it's something that's in the hand of domestic policymakers, but also global actors and global coalitions in terms of how we drive investment to where it's needed most and where it will be most efficacious. The second thing I just want to introduce at this point is the global energy system today is not especially equitable in terms of who has access to affordable energy, which societies and which individuals benefit from good access to affordable energy and all the benefits that come from that. And I think we need to recognize that as our starting point and recognize the need for investment in ways to enhance people's lives through the benefits that energy brings, whether that's in parts of the world where people don't have access to clean cooking technologies, to parts of the world where energy is available in theory, but in practice excludes a lot of segments of society because of the price of the energy and everything in between. And I think we need to think about what are the right policies in terms of no one denies that the end point of a renewable rich system is going to bring benefits in that regard, but we do need to recognize that important decisions need to be made as to the path that gets us there in terms of what are the financial implications of the very large amounts of investment that will be needed, not just in renewable technologies themselves, but in grids and associated systems and infrastructure. And let's not deny that there's a lot of investment needed in every part of the world, and there's a lot of political debate needed about who pays for it and how we make that as equitable as possible. I guess what I want to say as a whole, Rana, is to make the point that renewable policy needs to be set in that wider context of the other socioeconomic policy imperatives, whether it's a question of alignment with industrial policy, social policy, economic policy. And I see that emerging, just to take the African case again, what I think is interesting when you see a number of countries have a good understanding of as to why they are pursuing renewable deployment at pace. And just to name some examples, I could clearly name many, but Ethiopia is really interested in developing hydro so that it can export power to other neighboring countries. Egypt is investing a lot in renewables because it sees an opportunity to export not power but ammonia, and particularly into Europe, where we see a lot of growth for hydrogen-based fuels. Other countries like Namibia, Mauritania, others are seeing similar kind of strategies, where they're thinking about where is their comparative advantage, where are their resource strengths, and what are the trade and economic opportunities that renewables can power. And I think, any country benefits from a kind of a sense of thinking strategically in terms of aligning its energy policy and its renewable energy policy with industrial policy, but also with its social imperatives as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Let me directly build on, like you mentioned, Ethiopia, Egypt, but also the reality in many developing countries. And I think also where, because of the interest rates or capital costs, at least the perceived cost of renewables is very different. Nazra, what is your view, speaking from Kenya, speaking from the building sector that is very close to the societal part too, but then maybe specifically also, I think in all these cases, and I think all speakers have highlighted it, ultimately it comes down to local economic benefits. Whether it is, local can be quite different from local community level to local national level to local regional level. So I would be interested to hear your views and what is required here, because if we want to bring together, I guess, like energy policies, industrial policies, social, societal policies, trade, how do we ensure that we have such a holistic approach?
Thank you so much, Rana, for your question. I think firstly, we need to keep the conversation in the context of the global south. So as a starting point, I think it's important to highlight that renewable energy is not just about climate action. As you rightly pointed out, it is an economic imperative as well. But for Africa, there's also a layer to it in that this a renewable energy conversation is essentially a platform for also potentially unlocking new jobs and in a market that is rapidly shifting. Sustainability and investment is now a core focus for investors. And so when I tie that from an African perspective, and especially with the sector that I have the most visibility on, I see a keen opportunity, for example, to highlight why renewables are important in the context of African cities, for example, tying together both the national and subnational aspects.
Okay, I think we have Nasra has a connection issue. So maybe while she's reconnecting, Sophia, I think back to you on the question. You also spoke about we need to have basically the transition and the policies driving economic resilience. We also see that it really requires different. Okay, Nasra is back. Nasra, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So I really quickly, just to give the context of why renewables are important for African cities. African cities are growing rapidly, with urban populations expected to triple by 2050. And in this context, renewable energy presents an opportunity because urbanization in itself creates opportunities and challenges. So renewables can be a useful tool to power sustainable growth. Kenya has a 92% renewable energy share. However, with this in mind, does it really translate to energy access for Kenyans? And in this aspect, then renewable energy conversations and enabling this framework can ensure that Africans have energy access and security. And here you have the opportunity, for example, in having decentralized power generation so that cities can reduce dependency on unreliable or waste to energy solutions and micro hydropower. And this is particularly important because we're looking at making sure subnational actors also have access to opportunities, leveraging renewable energy to also unlock revenue at a subnational level. I think the other thing that is very, very critical for Africa is the fact that when it comes to climate resilience and adaptation, African cities are getting hotter, and tackling urban heat islands using renewable powered cooling solutions, for example, solar powered air conditioning and passive cooling in green buildings can really be a solution with respect to mitigating urban heat. But aside from that, as recently as last year, Kenya and a few other countries experienced floods in their cities. And renewables create an opportunity here for renewable powered early warning systems and smart water management so that cities can be better prepared for floods and extreme weather events. And that means then you're saving a lot of costs, because a lot of the times in Africa, what ends up happening is we're reacting to things after the fact rather than preparing for potential disasters. And that could be the difference between wiping out a budget or making the right partnerships so that we can leverage investment in preparing for these kind of settings. And I think what I also want to touch on is the fact that with Africa, a big priority, both at national and subnational level, is sustainable and affordable housing. And in this regard, renewable energy creates an opportunity for solar-powered affordable housing, for example. How can we integrate solar and energy-efficient designs in affordable housing so that the costs become lower for urban dwellers? And separately, in the same context of affordable housing, can we explore off-grid water and sanitation so that we have solar water pumps and wastewater treatments which improve water access in fast-growing cities? So from an economic perspective, when it comes to Africa, they're very, very closely tied to the social perspective, because we're essentially saying it's in your benefits to invest in renewables because there is an economic opportunity here, which then influences the social aspect. And in looking at this, then we would be able to ensure that the political and regulatory alignment is captured in a way that speaks to dignity when it comes to communities, prosperity when it comes to businesses, and of course, legacy when it comes to the politicians and the policymakers, because ultimately, the reality is a lot of African cities have climate action plans. And one of the key things that allows African states to meet the NDCs is integrating renewable energy in the different sectors so that they can then report on their NDCs. And I think what's critical as we think about this year is that with COP30 coming up, Africa is keen on, pushing the conversation around climate finance and energy equity. So what better way for cities to be a platform to equalize or at least try to equalize opportunities by leading on the renewable energy front so that they can leverage global funding. And I think in conclusion, for now, we really have an opportunity to leapfrog from fossil fuel dependency using cities. And these cities then create the powerful platforms with renewables as a tool to unlock the partnerships and the solutions that are needed to drive this economic growth. But of course, not leaving behind the fact that ultimately we also want to make sure there's an improvement when it comes to quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nasra. And I think also, and thanks for highlighting the importance of urban areas. I think also on the, it's 80% of global GDP that is basically generated in cities. Let me turn to you, Sophia. I think you mentioned the policy and also transition policies, but we also see the complexity, you see, because we are bringing together different types of policies. We need to ensure the alignment, probably a cross-sectoral alignment, but also alignment across governance levels to some extent. And then I think the way you mentioned it, Nasra, with basically dignity, prosperity, and legacy for policymakers, you see different agendas, I guess. What are good learnings? How do we basically, what are good learnings and good practice on policy that are driving economic resilience with renewables? Are there any leading examples we can learn from?
Thank you, Rana. And I think that what Nasra was just presenting about the role of cities, I think is fundamental. We have several initiatives that are working at the city level, and is the implementation of the NDCs at the city level. But if it is difficult to implement an NDC at national level, at city level it's even more complicated. That's why precisely I was mentioning the need for this, and Brian also touched upon all these issues, the need to have a comprehensive energy plan. And when you talk to the Ministry for Environment and the Ministry of Energy, it's not enough. You need to have trade, fiscal policies, etc. I think that in the sense of regulation, and I'm European, so I'm Spanish, and I think that what the EU has done at this integrated planning is a good model. It's not the only model. There are other examples, but it's kind of taking this leadership into bringing the energy and climate agenda together with with industrial policy, with transport policy, with agriculture policies, and the different mechanisms that are put in place, both for the resilience building after COVID and the recovery after COVID, but now also for what is coming after the invasion of Ukraine and the energy security, etc. Now is the era of competitiveness for the EU, and it's raising some questions about green within this clean industrial deal, the partnerships with third countries. Saying this, Europe is not the only continent doing these integrated approaches. I think that Brazil, that Nasra, you just mentioned, COP30, Brazil is also leading in this planning. And there are quite a lot of lessons learned from what countries from the global south or the majority world, or how do you want to call this huge variety of realities, because the reality in South Africa or Brazil is very, very different, but both are integrating just transition processes and mechanisms into their planning, human rights, indigenous rights. I think it's also important, equity, reskilling of workers. So it's all these type of policies that Brian was also mentioning when saying that energy need to take into account, energy planning also need to take into account social measures. So it's how to integrate these areas. And countries like Colombia, which is also a fossil fuel producer that has committed at COP29 to phasing out fossil fuels. It's how can we, and maybe from these excellent webinars that you have been organizing with REN21, Rana, it's also a question of us as stakeholders. How do we move from webinars and sharing knowledge and actions and activities into action? What can we do collectively to learn from these cases? I've mentioned South Africa, but I think also Kenya has good examples. In Africa, we are seeing good examples of country moving into this direction. Egypt was also mentioned. Morocco is also championing these approaches. In Asia, we also have the case of Vietnam. It's a very complicated and difficult scenario, but it's also mixing the industrial policy with the renewable energy policy, phasing out fossil fuels, with all the complications that are there. And to finalize, I think that the access to finance and the capital markets moving into the right direction and into the right sectors and into all the geographies, because Africa is underfunded, but other regions as well. And I would like to maybe raise the attention into the financing for development and the conference that is taking place in Sevilla, more for the concept of financing for development at large. The current mechanisms, international financing architecture, is definitely not working and is not ready to support the transition. So we really need to find the mechanisms and to change the direction of travel. And this is not going to be done only with climate finance. We need to go beyond. And domestic resource mobilization is also an important part, but international capital markets are also an important part. And in some regions, it's happening, but unfortunately, it's not happening fast enough. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I'll build on this, Sophia, and Brian, turning to you, you also spoke about the finance gap. Let's not have a finance discussion here, but I think we're all in agreement that, I mean, currently the financial markets are actually not guiding investors and the finance market into the right direction. Even when we're looking at fossil fuel and renewables, we're not even speaking about the resilience of economies here. So how do we actually I mean, there seems to be a need for paradigm shifts. Sam spoke about CBAM as a driver. We see that at the European Commission level, there are big questions how to survive with more stringent social and environmental policies in the globalized markets. I would be curious to hear, Brian, your thoughts on this. What are the things that need to really fundamentally change so that we are setting the course in the direction of building a renewable-based economy for economic reasons, for resilience reasons? And how do we probably move from discussion to action? Because I think this is a very important topic you raised, Sophia.
I think sometimes, Rana, what concerns me the most is not the overall scale of clean energy investment, but the geographic asymmetry of it. When you look at just over 80% of clean energy investment today is effectively in Western Europe, North America, and China, and the rest of the world, where to be frank, even if you were just an economist and saying where's the cheapest carbon abatement, you would look to many other parts of the world in terms of, let's say, value of tons of carbon available per euro or dollar of investment. Never mind the socioeconomic dimensions and the justice dimensions of that. And of course, a key issue for many parts of the world is the disparities in costs of capital. And I think that needs to inform financial institutions' decision making about recognizing that, first of all, governments can't deliver this investment on their own. Multilateral institutions can't deliver this investment on their own. But with the money that they do make available and can make available, what is the best impact of that investment in terms of addressing some of the reasons why costs of capital are so different in different parts of the world? And I think innovation is required by the funders and also the domestic policymakers to think about the use of capital to manage risk, to build some scale in markets, to build some confidence among investors and companies, and to show success that will then start to bring the cost of capital down. I think as well that it's back to the point I'm making earlier about governments making decisions about why are they driving renewables. And of course we see in many parts of the world is sharp focus on absolute lowest cost for their unit of energy from renewable auctions or support schemes or whatever else, which is absolutely has been very successful in driving down costs of renewable energy across the world. But we see in many situations where there hasn't left space for some of the social dimensions of renewable projects that would really make a difference in terms of how people are experiencing them, whether I'm thinking about social acceptance dimensions, community gain, community participation, investment in apprenticeships, investment in wider capacity building. And I think governments need to think about what they're willing to pay for and what their policy design will deliver and won't deliver, as companies need to think about that as well. So I think you need to put it in that wider context. And I totally agree with other speakers about at the end of the day, this is about a social change project in terms of encouraging social acceptance of infrastructure and encouraging people buying different things or behaving in different ways. And I think the whole element of public participation and public involvement is really important. And I do just want to mention that we've seen a lot of leadership, say, from Brazil in terms of its domestic policy action, but also as a global leader last year as president of G20, this year as president of COP30. South Africa has picked up that mantle in G20 for this year in terms of putting the social aspects and the justice aspects of transitions and energy policy more broadly center stage for those global elements. And just because you were asking earlier for examples, to mention one that I really liked mentioning is that in Canada, more than 20% of all power generation assets are partially or fully owned by Indigenous communities. It's a unique case in terms of the involvement of Indigenous communities who probably over the decades have thought of energy as extractive, exploitative, combative kind of issues, now have a direct emotional and financial stake in energy investment, particularly in the growth in clean energy assets. And it's really changed the landscape in terms of social acceptance debates, if I want to be a little strategic about it, but also in terms of who gains, who benefits, why are these renewable projects bringing resilience and economic benefit to regions and countries as a whole.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I must say, like, one of my preferred numbers or figures from last year was that the share of household and energy investment has moved from 9% to 18% in only 8 years because of solar rooftop, heat pumps, etc. And then also when we look at countries, you see like Pakistan, South Africa, Kenya, you see like the import, Lebanon, the import of solar PV. Because it's like cheaper in the end, but also because of load shedding has actually really led to a shift, you see, in the overall ownership, but also governance on energy. To close this discussion, because we will bring questions and the audience into this, Nasra, I would like to come back to you actually. Local value creation, we spoke about the subnational level, but also what is the role at the regional level too, and what are trends you might observe on the African continent here? And maybe another question linked to this, how do renewable energy change the supply chains? Not only on the renewable side, but also on the energy consuming sectors.
Thank you. So I'll start by, national and regional supply chains. I think with renewables, we have an opportunity to really encourage domestic production and essentially manufacturing and innovation. So I think we have an opportunity, for example, as you pointed out, with respect to domestic production of solar panels and batteries and wind components, then we can already create jobs. And so that's an overlooked opportunity that would feed not just manufacturing, but the sectors that are dependent on the products that are, to support the economy. And then by extension, create the green jobs that support these sectors. Separately, I also see an opportunity for renewables and transforming waste to energy models, for example. So if we think about using biomass in urban settings, then we would be complementing the circular economy. I also see the other opportunity when it comes to skills development, particularly for youth and women. And so as we think about the just transition, I think it's important to highlight and change the narrative, not just as a cost, but how can we support transition, which really explores how we can invest in green skills training, particularly for youth and women who are often really actively involved at a city scale and regionally in Africa, with youth having, if you like, one of the youngest populations globally. And we have an opportunity here to really leverage a call to action at a regional stage. For example, if I were to couch it in the context of the African Union, where we have the Agenda 2063, which essentially is all about the just transition, green, clean energy. How can we then potentially leverage this economic bloc to scale renewable projects and potentially have a checklist of what is a barrier and what is an opportunity from a regional perspective, a national perspective, and a subnational perspective. For Kenya, for example, a key bottleneck is the high upfront costs for a lot of renewable energy projects. So what are the alternatives for us to kind of kickstart that journey to ensure that we have, if you like, a boom in the renewable energy space when it comes to transactions and ways that we can drive that investment. The previous speakers talked about community engagement. This is very, very true. I think one of the biggest bottlenecks when it comes to the supply chain is you have, if you like, your higher ups, which are the CEOs, autocrats involved in the renewables space, talking about the importance of renewables, but this message doesn't translate to the common man, common woman, so that they can understand the importance of that on a day-to-day basis. And so if we start being targeted in this regard, then the businesses definitely will reflect that, because ultimately businesses have people working in them, whether it's the top notch or the bottom tiers. These are people, if they don't understand the message, they don't reflect it on their day-to-day production, remains what it was, rather than being progressive. And of course, we also need champions when it comes to our leaders. We need leaders who can understand and articulate what it means to unlock financing with renewables in mind. And I think that then will shift that supply chain, both subnationally, nationally, and regionally. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Nasra. So everything comes down to planning, policy, and people. So 3 Ps. Now we're opening this up. Sam, if you could join us here. We have a first question from Samson Nibi. Samson, would you like to join us here and share your question? And I invite everybody who would like to participate to raise your hand so that you can join us on the open seat here on the panel. Samson, are you coming? Otherwise, I'll just speak about, read out. So Samson was saying, like, many companies are, when we're looking at the energy consuming sector that are moving to renewable energy, many companies are facing issues installing their own renewable energy. There is a backlash from monopolistic electric companies. So if there are any advices to those companies, how to better navigate this pushback?
Wow. So this is something we come across on a regular basis. We work with a number of governments and regulators who are managing monopoly industries and managing the transition of monopoly industries. And the two biggest challenges members find in terms of the, getting new renewables, investing in their own renewables, is one, getting permission to do them. Can you do a power purchase agreement in Korea? Type question. Secondly, can you get it connected in time? So, without wanting to do a blatant promotion of RE100, the first one, the reason RE100 exists is to bring together the corporate voice, to show governments the advantages they can gain through allowing companies access to invest in renewables. So, for example, in South Korea, our members represent around 10% of South Korea's electricity demand. And that's a very compelling case when you speak to the minister to say, well, look, our members represent 10% of electricity demand in Korea. They'd like that to be 100% renewable, and they're prepared to invest. And that investment is billions of dollars. It's highly significant for those countries, and as a way of helping their transitions. And that has resulted in policy change in a number of countries, a number of markets, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc., etc. So working together is incredibly important. One company going one by one, saying we don't like the way the monopoly company works. They'll just say, well, tough, it's a monopoly. But if you're going as a group, it works really well, and that's what RE100 does. The second challenge is connecting to the grid, and this is a huge challenge around the world. I don't have the figures to hand, but there are years of delays. I think in the UK we had an 8-year delay for getting a project connected to the grid. That's a death knell to a renewable project if you can't get a return on investment because you simply can't attach to the grid. An absolute priority is, across the world, we need to sort out the grid challenge. Grids need to be fully upgraded, and we need to do so in a way that doesn't put an undue burden on the consumer. If electricity bills go up 50%, 100% because the grid needs upgrading, that is red meat to the anti-net zero movement. It's red meat to the anti-change movement. You say, it's all too expensive, stop it. We need to find ways, like the French did when they did their nuclear renaissance, nuclear revolution. We need to find new ways, different ways of getting that infrastructure paid for that doesn't land in the short term, in short-term spikes in consumers' bills.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sam. Iskander, you have a question. Why don't you join us here in the panel? Yes, hi.
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks for invitation. Very nice topic. I like this subject a lot. So I like Sam's example on cooperation, potential cooperation between Australia and South Korea. One is the largest producer of one of the largest steel producer in the world. The other one is also G7 member and large exporter of materials. But we are from people from developing world would like to see more examples of from the developing world that could be a case studies for us as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Any panelists who might have good examples? I think, Brian, you had mentioned Egypt and
I think, yeah, I'm sure others have others, but to recap, I think we have had just some of the countries we're talking to at the moment. Ethiopia is planning some hydro developments that are specifically focused on export to neighboring countries. Egypt and Namibia, both very interested in developing their renewable sectors in order to export various versions of hydrogen-based products, whether it's hydrogen, ammonia, or in Namibia's case, they want to develop their fertilizer sector to be based on renewables. So lots of interesting examples. Equally in Latin America, I think there's some really interesting examples of regional cooperation as well. So I think there's a realization that cooperation is a good thing in this sector, and I think there are many interesting emerging examples.
Nazra, Sophia, any examples you can think of? I think here it's very much about green industrialization more than just green electrons, right?
Yeah, I think that what Sam presented is valid for almost everywhere. I think it's general recommendations, and I think that Brian, Nasra, you also mentioned that there is no one size fits all. But in the case of Uganda, I mean, there is also the question of deregulation and then regulation. So there's been several changes, but it's kind of pursuing a proper also approach using renewables to ensure energy access. I think there are super interesting cases in the whole of Africa and Western Africa as well. And Brian just mentioned Latin America. I think the case of Chile is also very, very relevant, the case of Colombia. But looking at similarities with other regions, I think that Central America and the way they are also trying to integrate the electricity market there, it's very relevant for other regions and even for islands. I think that it's also a very peculiar case if we are looking at seeds or this other type of development. Madagascar is also currently trying and working with some countries in improving the way it is approaching and also connecting to green industrial policies. I also wanted to mention SMEs that has not been really mentioned, and it's an important and integral part of the value chain for renewable energy, not just for producing renewable energy and the renewable energy value chain, but also for the uses. And in the case of Peru, for instance, we've worked with them in developing a framework, a regulatory framework for the operation of SMEs. I think that sometimes we face barriers that are not really, some you were just mentioned the periods for big infrastructure processes, but it's also the way that the regulation is affecting SMEs that is also having a negative impact in renewables. And I didn't mention any case in Asia, but there are also good examples. I mentioned before Vietnam, but there are also good examples in Nepal, for instance, looking at hydropower and diversifying the electricity mix, the energy mix, and I think that the economy at large, and it's the way it is planned and tackled in different ways in different parts of the world.
Yeah, just to kind of complement that, I just wanted to say, for example, in Kenya and most global South countries are reactive markets and not proactive markets. And what I mean by this is often governments step in when they see there's going to be a huge negative implication by not kind of moving with what's going on globally, or the reverse is also true, where there's a huge opportunity, and if the government feels that they could miss out on this opportunity, they join in. And an example of this in Kenya is with our e-mobility sector. So, it started off with Basigo, which is essentially a e-bus company. Basigo was a pioneer in the Kenyan market, and essentially once they put in place the buses into the Kenyan market and then started gaining visibility in a global kind of platform, the government then was curious about what they were doing, invited them to have discussions, and then that kind of really gave strength to the e-mobility sector in Kenya. And as a result of which, once they won an award at, I think it was COP28 or COP28, the government then decided to explore what the e-mobility policy of the country could be or should be, so that more companies like Basigo could attract the funding, and of course, what it means for Kenya in terms of a sector and, the partnerships we could attract. So I think, correctly pointed out, no one size fit all perspective, but I think what's super important is Global South is often reactive. So sometimes the incentive is usually the private sector taking a lead in that regard.
So making basically champions visible, regardless what type of champions, to see and show the economic opportunities. Iskander, I see that you say, I better clarify my question. So maybe you clarified in the chat, we'll come back to this. I see we have another question of Mariana. Why don't you join us here, Mariana?
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for the panel discussion. It was extremely insightful. But again, I'm with Sophia here that we very often hear these discourses and we lack action, right? We all we wonder if we keep reinventing the wheel and wondering, okay, the enablers, obstacles, and we hear very often very great ideas, but we lack progress, right? So I would like to ask you, in this right moment in time, when it seems like we are in crunch time with all going on, what should be the dominant narrative if we really are to make the shift, the real shift to renewables happen?
Who wants to take this? Thank you, Mariana, for your question.
You're welcome.
I can start. I can give it a go. And I think it's a really good question. And I tried to hint it at the beginning of my intervention, is the narratives. We have the knowledge, we have the understanding. I mean, we have the World Energy Outlook every year that we are all jumping into it, and all the REN21 reports that have been prepared. I think that we don't really need to focus much on all these very technical issues, but it's the economic sense of this transformation. It's making sense for fossil fuel producers and for fossil fuel consumers. We are not going to be naive saying, oh, everybody's benefiting. No, there is going to be sector affected. So we also have to tackle this. But we have to create the right narrative and communicate it better. And I would also advocate for separating. This is not a left and right discussion. No, this is a common sense economic transformation issue. So we're seeing this in the US. It's which state is with the higher development of renewables? It's Texas. And why? Because it makes sense. They also produce oil, but it also makes sense to invest in renewables. It's also the question of resilience, and we also need to be careful in the way we deploy renewables. There is a big risk here that they are deployed in a way that they are damaging for the communities and for the environment. So we also need to tackle biodiversity issues, environmental impacts. Circular economy is fundamental. So it's creating this the right package that is not right or left or north or south, west, east, is for everyone, but adapted to the local realities, and making sure that we are tackling with the right narrative and avoiding confrontation and unusual using facts that are also better presented.
Thank you, Nazra. And then I see that Dose had a question, so I'll bring you in here.
Yeah, just to compliment Sophia, so we don't lack technical expertise in these conversations. What we lack is the relational. Who are we speaking to? Are we speaking to financiers? The bottom line matters. When we're speaking to communities, they want to their natural resources are not, interfered with, or their livelihoods are not at stake. So we need to have conversations that allow them to walk this journey with us. And the powerful aspect of relational really ties in both the economic, social, and the technical. But the key gap we have here is the bottom line, and no one is going to be adversely affected. And if they are, how do we mitigate this? So I'm very aligned with Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you. Dose, over to you for a quick question, because we're almost running out of time. It's always going too quickly.
Okay. I'm Dose from Togo. I'm the executive director of NGO ADET. I'm one of the World Bank Civil Society group. And last month, the World Bank vision for Africa is to electrify Africa about 300 person. Now they meet all the government leaders, and what is the summary of this meeting is that Africa needs a regulation in the sector. Africa needs training. Africa needs renewable energy materials, but Africa has a mineral which they can transform. So the free trade, Africa free trade system will be put ahead to move ahead the rapid transformation of Africa in energy aspects. This aspect is very, very preoccupying the governments of Africa.
Thank you.
Now, you, please, you want to ask Rana?
No, actually, I was going to, because we're running out of time, so I will maybe bring this back to the panelists as, okay, the reality is we also need to change global trade rules, but then with the critical minerals, I think it is also what are the opportunities to really build on those critical minerals to also create local economic opportunities for the African countries, while ensuring that we're serving the population with better energy access and 24/7 energy supply. I hope this is so.
You know, the reality in the Africa, this is the reality. But what me, as one of those who innovated the SDGs, what I think is that the multilateralism institution must be put in place at regional level, sub-regional level, national level, subnational level, and local level to coordinate well the process. Now, for the local production.
Sorry, we're really running out of time. So I would like to, I will build on this and give this back to my dear panelists. You have, each of you, 30 seconds, final statement. Please, if you could bring this comment into your thoughts. Closing.
Okay.
Would be great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sophia, over to you. 30 seconds. I will wave when it's over.
I think that I've mentioned it already, but I think it's focusing on the diversification and the benefits of the transition to the populations adapted to their realities, engaging with communities, and probably focusing on green public services from housing, transport, industry, and job creation.
Thank you. This is really good. Brian, economic resilience.
Yeah, I mean, at heart, energy policy, clean energy transitions, climate policy, they exist to make people's lives better. They exist to bring socioeconomic gain to people, to mitigate the ravages of climate change, to create jobs, to reduce air pollution, to increase resilience. I think we need to not get distracted into a technocratic, overly, kind of abstract policy domain, but keep those social goals in mind. I think that really informs our choices and some of our trade-offs in terms of how we design policy and how we work together.
Thank you, Brian. Nazra.
Thank you, Rana. So as I said before, renewable energy is not just about climate action, but an economic imperative to really create and build resilience for the cities, societies, communities, and really regions that can thrive in this new world. So yeah.
Thank you. And Sam.
Wow. A mea culpa, the demand from our members in Africa is woefully inadequate, and we need to build that, because with increased demand for renewable electricity comes greater supply. You can start to build supply chains, you can start to build the industries domestically that use those critical minerals, at source rather than exporting them at low cost to others who then add the value and import them back into your country. So onshoring some of that industry by growing demand for renewables is a huge task. Africa, the installations of renewables is a fraction of what we're seeing elsewhere in the world. We need to change that, and I think corporate demand has a big role to play. We're looking at it.
So thank you very much, Sam. And I guess I can say, since we did not manage to engage fully here, I think there is very clear follow-up on the energy consuming sectors and the businesses and SMEs and how we can mobilize them to build the economic opportunities also for Africa. My task is to thank all of you for a very interesting discussion, sharing your insights, Sam for the lightning talk, dear panelists, Brian, Sophia, Nazra, and everybody who has joined into the discussion. It won't end here because there is a lot of things to continue unpacking. And I'll end on this call that was raised by the panelists is how do we move from discussion to action? Because one thing is clear, nothing is going to happen if we don't make it a reality. So thanks a lot to all. If you want to dive deeper, please see our resilience briefs and continue exchanging on social media. Reach out to us if you have proposals where to continue the discussion. All sessions are available on the REN21 YouTube channel, and we'll certainly build on the discussion and the content to continue this further. Thanks a lot to all, and goodbye from Paris.